The watchful eye. The city was a different place after dark. The usual bustle of traffic and foot traffic was replaced by the low hum of streetlights and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Officer Daniel Harris had learned to appreciate the quiet during his late-night patrols. It wasn't the silence he found soothing, but the chance to observe, to think, and to reflect. The city always felt different at night, as though the streets were full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. And Daniel, ever the curious cop, had learned not to ignore his instincts. This particular night, as the clock struck midnight, Daniel was standing on his usual corner at the intersection of M and Oak. He leaned slightly against the brick wall of a small weathered building, the cool night air brushing against his uniform. He adjusted his cap and glanced at his watch. The quiet was punctuated only by the distant sounds of cars whizzing by, their headlights flickering like fireflies in the distance. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows, and the city seemed to be holding its breath. The night felt endless, stretching on without end. But just as he was about to pull out his phone and check in with dispatch, something caught his eye. A figure appeared in the distance, moving down the street with purpose. A woman. Daniel squinted against the darkness, trying to make out the details. She was walking quickly, her head slightly down, her pace almost erratic. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, something that didn't fit with the quiet surroundings. He'd seen many people wander the streets at night, some aimlessly, others in a hurry to get home. But this woman, there was something different about her. Her clothes were worn, frayed at the edges, and her hair was pulled back haphazardly into a ponytail. It wasn't the disheveled appearance that caught his attention, though. It was the heavy backpack she carried. It looked out of place, its bulk mismatched with the woman's frail frame. The bag sagged under the weight of something that didn't belong. It wasn't just any backpack, it seemed, packed with more than the average day-to-day necessities. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He wasn't sure why, but his instincts kicked into overdrive. Something about her made him uneasy. He could tell by the way she carried herself that this wasn't a woman out for a late-night stroll. The way she kept glancing over her shoulder, the way her eyes flickered nervously between the street and the ground. It spoke volumes. As she got closer, Daniel made the decision to approach. He'd always trusted his gut, and tonight was no different. He stepped into the street, his shoes clicking softly on the pavement as he called out, "Mom." The woman startled at the sound of his voice, her head snapping up, her wide eyes locking with his for a split second. Daniel noticed something in her gaze, something raw and vulnerable. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was exhaustion. Deep, soul-wearied exhaustion. She seemed like she hadn't slept in days, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman hesitated, as though considering whether or not to answer. And then, without another word, she quickly looked away, as though trying to make herself invisible. It was the kind of behavior that set off alarms in Daniel's head. A person with nothing to hide wouldn't behave this way. "Is everything all right?" Daniel asked again, stepping a little closer but trying to keep his voice calm, professional. He didn't want to make her feel cornered, but there was something in her posture, something in the way she tried to avoid his gaze, that made him worry. The woman's eyes darted to him again, and this time, she took a step back. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice shaky, almost too hurried, as if to convince both herself and him of her safety. But there was something in the way she said it that didn't sit right with Daniel. There was an edge to her voice, a cracking vulnerability that only a person under great strain could have. Daniel's hand instinctively hovered over his radio. He wanted to ask more questions, wanted to make sure she was all right. But his duty as a cop also reminded him that he needed to respect her space. He wasn't about to push her too hard, not yet. He didn't know why, but something told him there was more to this encounter than just a random woman walking the streets. She seemed to sense his hesitation, as if she could feel the weight of his suspicion. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked at the ground again. "I gotta go," she muttered, her voice quieter now, tinged with urgency. She shifted the weight of her backpack and hurried on, her footsteps quickening. Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing. He watched her back as she disappeared into the night, swallowed up by the dim light of the street lamps. He glanced at the spot where she had been standing, his eyes lingering on the faint impression of her footsteps in the dust. Why had she been so frightened? What was she hiding? There was a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach, an unease that wouldn't let go. It wasn't like him to let something like this go unanswered, but he knew better than to follow her right then and there. She was already gone. But the truth was, something about this encounter had left a mark on him. He found himself questioning everything. Was she just a lonely woman, walking the streets in the dead of night, minding her own business, or was there more to her story than she was letting on? As the minutes ticked by, Daniel felt the familiar rhythm of the city settle back into place. But for him, nothing felt quite the same. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he had missed, some detail he hadn't noticed. It wasn't just her strange behavior, it was everything. The way her backpack weighed her down, the fear in her eyes, the way she had avoided his gaze, all of it pointed to something that didn't make sense. And so, Daniel did what any officer with a hunch would do. He decided to follow her. This time, Daniel wasn't just watching from afar. He wasn't just waiting for something to happen. He was going to find out what was going on with this woman, Maya Williams. It wasn't the first time he had followed someone down these streets, but it was the first time he felt this strongly about it. He waited for a few minutes before pulling his patrol car out from its spot down the street. He kept the lights off, moving slowly so he wouldn't draw attention to himself. As he turned the corner, he saw her again, still walking, still carrying that strange, bulging backpack. Maya's movements were quicker now, more deliberate. She glanced over her shoulder again, her eyes flicking nervously from side to side. Daniel couldn't tell if she was being paranoid or if she was just trying to make sure she wasn't being followed. Either way, he couldn't help but feel the weight of her distress as it seeped into the air around her. He followed at a safe distance, careful not to make his presence known. The streetlights flickered above, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to dance across the sidewalk. Maya continued down the darkened street, unaware of the cop trailing her in the quiet night. Daniel's heart was pounding in his chest. The question swirling in his mind only deepened with every step. What was she hiding? What was inside that bag? What had she been running from? All he knew was that tonight was no ordinary night, and this was no ordinary woman. The pursuit. The streets grew quieter the farther Daniel followed her. The usual bustle of the city had long since faded into the background, leaving only the steady sound of his tires on the asphalt and the occasional creak of his car's suspension as it made its way around corners. The headlights of his patrol car painted long shadows across the sidewalk, but he kept the lights off, making sure to stay hidden in the darkness, as though he were a part of the night itself. Maya Williams, as he now knew her name, moved with purpose, her steps quick and urgent, but not panicked. She was trying to stay composed, but Daniel could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the subtle way her head kept swiveling, checking for anything, or anyone, following her. It was the type of caution one adopts when they feel hunted, even if they can't pinpoint exactly why. Daniel's grip tightened around the wheel, his mind racing. What could she possibly be running from? His instincts told him that there was more to her story than a woman out for a midnight walk. The way she'd reacted when he spoke to her earlier had only confirmed that. Fear, discomfort, and something deeper, something buried in the lines of her face. Her movements grew more erratic as they neared a quieter part of town, away from the main roads. The buildings here were older, their windows dark, and their doors closed tight. The occasional stray cat darted between the shadows, and the faint sound of distant music or laughter could be heard from a few blocks away. But here, the silence seemed almost oppressive. It was the kind of silence that settled over you like a weight, pressing in from all sides. She turned another corner, and Daniel slowed his car, making sure he didn't get too close. He could barely make out her figure now, but her backpack, a large bulging thing that had caught his eye earlier, was still unmistakable. It hung from her shoulders, and she adjusted its weight every now and then, wincing as though it was causing her some kind of pain. He followed her down the narrow, dimly lit street, his mind still racing with questions. What was inside that bag? Was it something dangerous? Could it be the reason she seemed so scared? His thoughts began to spin out of control. The more he followed, the more he realized how little he knew about her, how little anyone knew. He had no idea if she was even from this part of town. No idea what she was doing here or why she was so determined to avoid any contact with him. Suddenly, she stopped. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't prepared for this. He had been trailing her from a distance, keeping his observations passive, trying not to draw attention. But now, as Maya came to a halt in the middle of the empty street, something inside him told him he was getting too close to something dangerous. He watched her closely as she stood motionless for a few moments. The eerie stillness of the moment stretched on, and for a second, Daniel couldn't decide whether to keep his distance or to confront her again. He could see her breath, shallow and quick, as she stood there, eyes scanning the street like a cornered animal. She didn't look scared of him, per se, but more like she was afraid of something, or someone else. Before he could decide what to do, she suddenly moved again, quicker this time. She darted into an alleyway between two buildings, disappearing into the darkness without a second glance behind her. Daniel's instinct kicked in immediately. Without hesitation, he hit the gas and followed her. The alley was narrow and tightly packed with old, rusted trash bins, broken streetlights, and faded advertisements. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale garbage, and it felt like a whole different world from the polished streets he had just been patrolling. He slowed down as he reached the entrance of the alley, careful not to make too much noise. He didn't want to alert her. He could see her silhouette up ahead now, moving quickly, her pace even faster than before. She was headed toward a small weathered door tucked between two buildings, a door that Daniel didn't recognize, one that looked abandoned, uninviting. The kind of door that didn't seem to belong to anything legitimate. What was she doing here? He parked the patrol car a little ways down the alley, making sure it was out of sight, and quietly got out. He kept to the shadows, moving cautiously so as not to draw attention. The silence was almost suffocating now, broken only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps on gravel and the distant echo of cars on main roads. As he approached the door, he saw her again, standing in front of it, hesitating. She looked at the door, then back over her shoulder, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Was she waiting for someone? Was she being followed? The look in her eyes, a mixture of determination and fear, made his chest tighten with concern. Something was wrong, and whatever it was much bigger than he could have imagined. Maya knocked on the door, 3 rapid raps, then stepped back, her body tense, ready for something. Daniel's mind spun faster. Who was she meeting? Was it someone dangerous, or was she trying to escape someone? The door creaked open just enough for a hand to appear, holding the knob. The figure behind it was hidden in shadows, and Maya exchanged a few brief words with whoever was on the other side. Daniel couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the anxious way Maya looked at the door, the way her eyes darted back down the alley before meeting the figures. Then, as quickly as it had opened, the door slammed shut, leaving Daniel standing there in the silence, his heart hammering in his chest. What had just happened? Who had she been speaking to? Daniel's mind raced with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Maya Williams was tangled in something much darker than he had anticipated. She wasn't just a scared woman walking through the streets. There was a reason she was hiding. There was something in that backpack, something in her past, something that had forced her into this strange, dangerous dance. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what she was involved in, what kind of trouble she had gotten herself mixed up in. And somehow, despite the growing danger in his gut, Daniel knew he couldn't stop now. The hidden truth. Daniel lingered in the shadows of the alley, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He was only a few steps away from the door that had just closed behind Maya. The heavy silence seemed to hang in the air, thick with the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. What had she been doing here? Who was she meeting? Why had she looked so nervous? He could still feel the weight of her fear from earlier that night, her hasty movements, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. But now, after seeing her interact with the mysterious figure behind that door, the puzzle pieces started to shift in his mind. Maya wasn't just a frightened woman. She was part of something bigger, something he couldn't quite comprehend yet. But it was only a matter of time before he figured it out. Daniel took a step forward, trying to decide what to do next. His training told him to approach this cautiously. He had no idea who was on the other side of that door, or what they were involved in. But his instincts, the same ones that had led him to follow her in the first place, told him he couldn't just walk away now. With careful steps, Daniel made his way to the side of the building, inching closer to the door. He tried to remain as quiet as possible, pressing his back against the cold brick wall to stay out of sight. Through the small crack in the doorframe, he could barely make out the sound of muffled voices, their words too soft to hear clearly. But the tone was unmistakable, tense, urgent, like a conversation between people who had something to hide. Daniel strained his ears, trying to pick out any hint of what they were discussing. The door had been securely shut, but the slight gap at the top allowed just enough sound to leak through. He caught a few words, fragments of a conversation that didn't make sense at first. "It's getting too risky. Can't keep doing this. If we stop now, it'll be worse. Need more time. Don't trust him. Don't trust anyone." The voices were distant, but each word sent a chill through Daniel's spine. It was clear now that this wasn't just a late-night rendezvous between two strangers. No, this was something darker, something dangerous, and Maya was caught in the middle of it. The anxiety gnawing at him grew stronger as the conversation continued. He couldn't make out every word, but the tone was enough. Whoever Maya was dealing with, they were nervous. The mention of trust, the warnings, it all felt like a setup, like people trapped in a dangerous game where no one could afford to make a mistake. After a few minutes, the voices fell silent. Daniel held his breath, waiting for the next move. The door didn't open again. He tried to peek around the corner of the building, but there was no movement inside. He strained to hear, but the silence stretched on, unnerving him. What was going on in there? Suddenly, he heard a soft click, the faint sound of a lock turning. The door creaked open slightly, and for a brief second, Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming out. He quickly pressed himself back into the shadows, his body tense. He watched as a tall figure emerged from the door, silhouetted against the dim light from inside. The person was tall, their movements deliberate and slow, as if they knew someone was watching. The figure glanced around cautiously before stepping out into the alley, the door closing quietly behind them. Daniel's heart pounded. He couldn't let this person see him. He had to stay hidden, to stay one step ahead. He held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the shadows as the figure walked past him. The faint light from the street lamp illuminated their face for a split second, and Daniel froze. It was a man he recognized, Ethan Miller. Daniel had seen him before. Ethan was a local who had been involved in several shady deals around the city. He was known for his connections to the underground, dealing with everything from stolen goods to illicit substances, but he had always managed to stay just out of reach of the law. And now, here he was, walking down the alley like it was any other night, after having just met with Maya. Daniel's mind raced as he watched Ethan move further down the alley. This was no coincidence. Maya was tangled up with Ethan, and whatever it was, it couldn't be good. The moment Ethan was out of sight, Daniel quickly stepped forward, making his way to the door. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to act fast. He needed to find out what was happening inside that building, and he needed to do it before Maya disappeared again. He reached for the door handle, testing it carefully. To his surprise, it was unlocked. The door creaked open silently, and Daniel slipped inside, his footsteps barely making a sound on the worn wooden floor. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the scent of old leather and dust. The space was small, cramped, nothing like what he had expected. The walls were bare, save for a few faded posters that seemed out of place. The dim light from a single hanging bulb illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a table in the center, cluttered with papers, some scattered, others neatly stacked. A map of the city was pinned to the wall, with several locations marked in red. It was a planning room. But what was being planned? Daniel's gaze quickly moved to the corner of the room, where a small safe stood against the wall. His heart skipped as he noticed it was slightly ajar, as though someone had been in a hurry to get something out. He didn't need to guess what it was. The backpack. The one Maya had carried all this time. He moved toward the safe, his footsteps almost silent against the creaking floorboards. His mind spun with possibilities. What could she possibly be involved in? Was it drugs? Stolen money? Something worse? As he reached for the safe, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was coming back. He quickly stepped back, his hand on his gun, ready for whatever was about to happen. He had crossed a line now. He wasn't just a cop following a lead. He was in too deep, and once the truth came to light, there would be no going back. The burden of secrets. The footsteps grew louder, and Daniel instinctively pressed himself against the wall, just out of sight of the doorway. His breath was shallow, his heart racing. He had crossed the threshold into dangerous territory, and now there was no turning back. The darkened room felt colder as the silence stretched on, only broken by the distant hum of the city outside. He held his breath, listening carefully, his hand still poised on his sidearm. A figure appeared in the doorway. A woman, tall and slender, with a face he didn't recognize. She stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor, breaking the quiet stillness of the room. She paused just inside the threshold, scanning the space with a calculating gaze before turning her attention to the table, where papers were scattered haphazardly. The way she moved spoke of confidence, authority, and something darker, like she had the power to control whatever was happening here. She wasn't alone. Behind her, Ethan Miller's familiar figure emerged from the shadows. He looked even more menacing than before, his eyes darting around the room, assessing everything with a cold, detached intensity. Maya wasn't far behind him, her eyes locked on the floor as she walked, her hands clenched tightly around the straps of her bulging backpack. There was something in her demeanor now, a resigned emptiness in her movements, as though she had already accepted the role she had been forced to play. Daniel's stomach tightened. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He had followed her, trailed her, only to realize that Maya wasn't just a random woman on the street. She was a pawn in something far more dangerous, something that involved people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The woman, who Daniel now assumed to be in charge, spoke first, her voice sharp and direct. "You're late," she said, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Maya, her tone filled with both annoyance and impatience. Maya didn't respond immediately, only shifting uncomfortably under the woman's gaze. Her shoulders hunched slightly, and Daniel could see the tension in her body, the way she stood just a little too still, like she was bracing for impact. He could feel her fear, its weight pressing down on her. She wasn't in control here. Not anymore. "Apologies," Ethan said smoothly, his voice dripping with insincerity. "We had to make sure we weren't being followed. You know how it is." The woman didn't seem convinced. Her gaze flickered toward the door, then back to Maya. "And what's in the bag?" she asked, her voice cold and calculating. "Is that what I think it is?" Maya hesitated, her lips parting as if she were about to speak but couldn't find the words. Daniel could see the inner turmoil in her eyes, the conflict between what she had been forced to do and what she knew was right. She looked at Ethan, then back to the woman, before finally answering in a strained voice, It's the information you asked for. The files. The contact details. The woman's eyes gleamed with something like satisfaction, but there was no warmth in it. Good, she said, her tone barely more than a whisper. And the payment. Maya shifted uncomfortably again. Daniel could see her hands trembling as she reached into the bag. He couldn't help but wonder what was inside. What kind of files could be so important? Why had Maya, of all people, gotten mixed up in something like this? As Maya slowly pulled out a folder from the bag, Daniel caught a glimpse of a logo, one that was unfamiliar to him. It was a sleek, modern design, sharp and professional, but there was something about it that set his nerves on edge. It was too clean, too precise. It didn't belong to any legitimate organization he knew of. This was no ordinary transaction. Whatever was in this folder, it wasn't just paperwork. It was something that had the potential to destroy lives. Maya handed the folder to the woman, her hands shaking slightly as she did. The woman took it without a word, inspecting the contents with a practiced eye. For a moment, all was silent except for the rustling of papers. Ethan stood by, his expression unreadable, as if he was watching the scene unfold with detached curiosity. Daniel's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. Maya was handing over something of great value, but why was she so terrified? Why had she become involved in this dark exchange? And who were these people? The woman, the mysterious figure in charge, seemed to hold the power here, but Maya had the key. Then the woman looked up, her eyes locking onto Maya's. "You've done well," she said, her voice now coldly approving. "But don't think for a second that you're out of this. You're too valuable to let go." Maya flinched, but the woman's words were like a cold slap. I just want out," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've done everything you asked. Please, just let me go." The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, one that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "You don't get to leave until we're finished with you," she said, her voice low and threatening. "Do you understand?" Maya's face paled, and she nodded slowly, her eyes filling with a mixture of fear and defeat. She had no choice now. She was trapped, caught in a web of lies and manipulation, and there was no way out. Not for her. Not now. Daniel couldn't stand it anymore. He had to do something. He had been a cop long enough to know that this was not just an ordinary transaction. This was criminal, dangerous, and everything about it screamed that Maya was in far deeper than she realized. He couldn't let her sink any further into this mess. He had to get her out. But how? His mind raced as he weighed his options. The safe, the files, the people involved. He couldn't just barge in and arrest them all. He wasn't ready for that. Not yet. And if he made the wrong move, Maya could end up paying the price. In the midst of his internal conflict, a small noise caught his attention. The soft creak of a floorboard. Someone else had entered the room. Daniel froze. The choices we make. The creak of the floorboard echoed in the dim room, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone else had entered the room. He didn't need to see who it was to know that it couldn't have been good. His grip on his gun tightened as he instinctively moved further into the shadows, blending into the darkness of the room. Whoever had just stepped inside didn't make a sound as they moved through the room, but the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The floor creaked again, then a voice, low and smooth, cut through the silence like a knife. "Is everything in place?" Daniel's pulse quickened. The voice was unfamiliar, cold, and calculating, the kind of voice that made you feel like you were being scrutinized from every angle. It wasn't the woman, the one in charge. It was someone new, someone even more dangerous. Maya's voice trembled slightly, but she forced herself to speak with what little composure she could muster. "It's all there," she said, glancing nervously at the man standing in the doorway. "Everything you asked for. The files. The payment." The newcomer didn't reply immediately. He stepped further into the room, his figure just a silhouette against the faint light filtering through the curtains. His presence seemed to fill the space, pressing in on Daniel like an unseen weight. He could feel the power in his movements, the way the man carried himself, like he had absolute control over everything around him. Then the stranger spoke again, his voice laced with dark amusement. "I'm not here for the payment, Maya. You think you've done enough, but you haven't. You never will." Maya flinched at the words, and Daniel could see her shoulders tense, as if preparing for a blow. The fear was palpable, radiating from her like a physical force, and Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness for her. She wasn't just some innocent bystander caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was a victim, trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape from. The man continued, his words cutting through the silence like a cruel taunt. "You think you're free now, don't you? You think after all you've done, we'll just let you walk away. But it's not that simple. People like you don't just get to disappear." Maya swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but it was clear she was struggling to hold herself together. "I didn't want any of this," she whispered. "I just want out. I didn't ask for any of this. Please." The stranger took a step closer, and Daniel could hear the shift in his demeanor. There was no longer any amusement in his voice, only cold, calculated determination. "You should have thought of that before you made the choice to get involved. You made your bed, Maya. Now you get to lie in it." Maya's face crumpled in distress, the weight of her situation becoming too much to bear. Daniel's eyes darted to the door. There was no way he could just stand by and watch her crumble. He had to do something. The weight of the moment was pressing down on him, and every instinct he had screamed at him to act. He couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. Before he could make a move, the man turned toward the table, his gaze landing on the folder Maya had handed over. He reached for it slowly, almost reverently, as if savoring the moment. The contents of that folder were a key to a dangerous game of power, manipulation, and control. What was inside? What could be so valuable that people would go to such lengths to acquire it? Daniel's thoughts raced. He needed to know what was inside that folder. But more than that, he needed to know who these people were. Who was this stranger? And why had Maya become entangled with them? The stranger flipped through the papers inside the folder with methodical precision, scanning each one before discarding them carelessly onto the table. He wasn't interested in the details. He was interested in the bigger picture, the information that could shift the balance of power, the kind of information that could change everything. But what was it? Without warning, he slammed the folder shut, his expression darkening. "This isn't good enough," he muttered under his breath, his frustration evident in his tone. "You brought me scraps. This isn't what I asked for. Do you understand that? This is a failure." Maya recoiled, visibly shaken by the harsh words. Her voice cracked as she spoke again, almost pleading. I did everything you asked. I couldn't get anything else. I swear." The man cut her off, his voice icy and final. "Your excuses don't matter. You failed, and now you're going to pay for it." Daniel's blood ran cold as the man moved toward Maya, his hand gripping her arm with a bruising force. She winced in pain, her eyes wide with terror as she tried to pull away. But the man's grip was unyielding. Her desperation was palpable, but there was nothing she could do. She was powerless. Daniel's heart raced, his instincts screaming at him to act. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, rage, fear, and determination all blending together. He couldn't stand by and watch this happen. Not to her. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. The man had Maya pinned, his face just inches from hers. His breath smelled of alcohol and tobacco, his voice rough as he spoke in a low, threatening tone. "You've made your choice, Maya. Now you'll pay the price." For a moment, the room felt like it was spinning. Daniel was consumed with a surge of adrenaline. The situation had escalated beyond what he had prepared for. This wasn't just about surveillance anymore. It wasn't about uncovering a secret or following a hunch. It was about saving someone who was trapped in a system much larger than herself. He reached for his gun, the cold metal reassuring in his hand. He could end this right now. But there were still so many questions. Who were these people? And why had they been targeting Maya? As he took a step toward the scene unfolding before him, the door suddenly swung open, startling everyone in the room. A voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the tension. "Step away from her. The final choice." The door swung open with a force that rattled the thin walls, and a voice, rich with authority and unshakable resolve, sliced through the room. "Step away from her." Daniel froze. The voice, commanding and sharp, sent a jolt through him, like a wake-up call to reality. His eyes darted toward the entrance, and what he saw stunned him into silence. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and imposing, with a presence that commanded the room without uttering a single word. His posture was rigid, but there was an unmistakable calm to the way he held himself, an unspoken power that seemed to emanate from every inch of him. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto the man holding Maya, as if daring him to challenge the order. Maya's face lit up with a flicker of recognition, but it was fleeting, like a distant memory trying to resurface from the depths of her mind. She didn't move, but Daniel could see the way her body tensed as though she was unsure whether to feel relief or fear. The stranger holding her didn't flinch, but there was a brief flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face as he sized up the newcomer. For a moment, everything hung in the balance, silent and heavy. "Who the hell are you?" The man who had been tormenting Maya growled, his grip tightening on her arm. "You're in my way." The newcomer didn't budge, his gaze unwavering. "I don't care who you are," he said quietly, his voice smooth but laced with an undeniable threat. "But I'm telling you this, let her go. Now." The air in the room felt as if it had thickened, charged with a palpable tension. Every muscle in Daniel's body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to act, but there was something about this stranger, something dangerous, that made him hesitate. He wasn't sure if this man was an ally or a greater threat to Maya's safety than the one she was already facing. Maya looked from the stranger to the man holding her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, her eyes wide, filled with an emotion Daniel couldn't quite read. She was stuck between two worlds, the world of the people who had manipulated her, and this new, mysterious figure who appeared to be the only person in her life who could possibly help her. The question hung in the air. Was this new figure someone who could truly protect her, or was he part of an even darker force? The man holding her scowled, his fingers digging into her arm. "I don't think you understand, friend," he snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "Oh, it does," the newcomer replied, his voice low and unyielding. "It concerns me a great deal." He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the other man, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You don't want to do this. You don't want to be the one who makes the mistake of crossing me." The man's grip on Maya faltered slightly, and for a brief second, Daniel thought the tension would snap. But then the stranger spoke again, his voice calm, measured. "I'll say it one last time," he said, stepping even closer, his presence now dominating the room. "Let her go. Now." For a moment, the room was still. The man holding Maya seemed to weigh his options, his face contorting with indecision. He knew he wasn't in control anymore, but he wasn't willing to give up so easily, not without a fight. A second later, the man swung his arm back, aiming a brutal punch at the newcomer's face. But it never landed. The stranger moved with the speed of a striking viper, his hand snaking out to intercept the punch midair. With a quick, fluid motion, he twisted the man's arm behind his back, forcing him to the floor with a sickening crack. The man cried out in pain, but the stranger didn't seem to care. He only pressed harder, ensuring that his captive was unable to move. "Enough," the stranger said, his voice cold as ice. Maya was freed from his grip, and she collapsed onto the floor, trembling, her hand instinctively clutching her backpack, as though it were her only connection to the world she had once known. She looked up at the man now standing between her and the one who had hurt her. Her voice was a fragile whisper. "Thank you," she started, but the words faltered on her lips as the stranger looked down at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was completely silent, save for the sound of Maya's soft breaths. Daniel watched from his hidden position, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been ready to intervene, but the situation had played out in ways he hadn't expected. Who was this man? What did he want with Maya? And what was he truly capable of? The stranger turned his attention to Maya, his voice softer now, though still filled with authority. "We need to go. Now." Maya hesitated, confusion flickering in her eyes. "But where?" "I don't." "It's not safe here," the stranger interrupted. "Trust me. There's no time for explanations. You're not safe, and you won't be until we get you somewhere protected." Maya's breath hitched in her throat, her hands shaking as she rose to her feet. She glanced at the man still writhing on the floor, then back to the stranger, unsure of what to do next. Daniel could see her internal struggle, the hesitation that lingered, the feeling of being caught between two worlds. But he could also see the truth. Maya was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and she had reached the point where she couldn't handle this fight alone anymore. Her entire life had been torn apart by forces beyond her control, and now, for the first time, someone had come to offer her a way out. The stranger extended his hand to her, an unspoken promise of safety, of deliverance from the nightmare she had been living. She hesitated one final time before placing her hand in his, her fingers trembling as if this simple action might be the hardest thing she had ever done. "Let's go," the stranger urged softly. But just as they started to turn toward the door, the room was flooded with the harsh, blinding light of sirens. The unmistakable sound of police cars, their engines roaring to a halt just outside, filled the air. "Freeze. Hands where I can see them," a voice from the doorway shouted, and the heavy footsteps of approaching officers echoed ominously. Maya's eyes widened in panic. She hadn't expected this. She had thought she was free, at least for the moment. But now, as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the room, the walls seemed to close in on her once more. Daniel's heart raced as he watched the standoff unfold. He had no idea how this would end. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next, Maya's life, and his own, was about to be changed forever.